talk about, sort of the shift left security movement. Obviously, it's a fairly well practiced scenario where, I think the sort of underpinnings of it are, the earlier in a process that you can catch a problem, the more cost effective it is to fix that problem, right? So nobody wants to be in a situation where you're getting ready to deploy and suddenly you're running a bunch of tests and found a security issue. So I think there's been a lot of companies that have sort of come out and started to adopt their tool or adapt their tooling to ultimately go ahead and support that piece of this, right? So if you think about DevOps and DevSecOps tooling that's out there, and adding automation to some of those tests, and I think some of the challenges in in those shift left practices, I've sort of listed them out here. And by the way, far from comprehensive. I'm sure there'll be some developers out there that could give me an education, in terms of some of the things that they have to deal with, right? But I think, things like increased workload. I mean, the industry has done a really good job of trying to automate this, right? But at the end of the day, when you catch things early, you have to fix them early, right? So, you're catching and catching all those security issues right up front. Obviously that leads to, sort of increased workload, lack of security expertise. Now, this isn't necessarily the truth everywhere, but in general, I think, I've met my share of security experts, and I've met my fair share of outstanding developers, and there's not always that overlap, right? So I think there's some of this that is, ultimately a scenario where that adds a little bit more cognitive load to the developer because they're not necessarily security experts. Tooling and tool integration, right? So this is one of those things where, I know I've in my career as a product guy, I've worked with developers, and you can almost feel them roll their eyes. Another tool. Oh, there's another tool now that's going to examine my work, or there's another tool that I have to integrate my process with, right? So that's another challenge, right? And then there's measurement and metrics, right? So how do you measure success, right? So, it's one of those things that I've said it here a lot, especially at OpsMX, given the nature of our solution. You know, let's assume that you do all these things. Let's assume that you create the right culture and the developers are comfortable with sort of the way you're implementing it, and you're spending the dollars on the tooling. How do you know how well it's working? How do you know if you're being successful? How do you define success, right? I mean, a mentor of mine once told me, you can't claim the success of a security program is that I never got hacked. So how do you define that, right? And it's one of those things where I think that becomes another challenge here, right? From an organizational perspective, and then from a sub-organizational perspective, specifically within the development team, how do I know whether or not what I'm doing is successful? Because I certainly am putting in the effort, I'm putting in the time, I'm, again, under the right set of cultural circumstances, I'm doing all those things that the organization's asking me to do. And, this last one here around measurement and metrics is, how is that translating into a successful program? Right. And then the other piece of this, there's sort of the people, and then there's the workflow, right? So then we just talked about a little bit about the people challenges, and now we'll talk a little bit about the workflow challenges. And I think, again, we're back to tool overload, right? Anybody that's seen a presentation of mine in the past, most of the time what I'll do is I'll bring up a slide that looks like the periodic table of elements or some other slide that is just jam-packed with logos. That's the DevOps, DevSecOps, software delivery, sort of marketplace, right? And so there's a lot out there, and I think, a lot of times the security teams will go out and shop these tools and understand, sort of what they want, and then ultimately that gets rolled down to the developers, the engineering team, the product managers, in terms of how to go about effectively implementing those things. Of course, priority conflicts, balancing security requirements with the need to meet development deadlines, that's always a challenge, right? And that's why I think, one of the things we're going to talk about today is things like exception handling. But I think, there's nobody that can define that for you, right? Sort of how to handle those priority conflicts. It really depends on the business you're in, who your customers are, what risks are at stake, and then ultimately down to what are the security findings you're considering not fixing, right? That's, I think, the most important decision there. Um, Again, the mindset change. Again, I think there'll be there always has been, at least in my experience, a little bit of resistance because again, you're piling more on. Unless you can tell a really good automation story, it's really hard. And then obviously you get into workflow disruptions and then slower build times. I think this is always something that all the developers and engineering groups I've worked with, those slower build times are sort of really big holes in productivity, right? And it's not productivity for productivity's sake. These folks are sort of working under a deadline, right? There's guys like me breathing down their neck saying, at what point is this going to be ready? Or hey, I've made a commitment to a customer. I've made a commitment to the market for this particular feature. And then ultimately, they grow frustrated because things slow down. Cycle times are longer, right? In order to sort of deploy something, test it, get the feedback, and then do it again, right? So again, I think these are all things that impact the development workflow, and then ultimately on that previous slide, impact the people, right? And so this is what tends to make it harder when